Independence at all costs, artistic integrity, and private personality versus public persona are all major themes of James Mangold's latest biopic, A Complete Unknown. While the film takes a look at a few years of Bob Dylan's life in the 60s, the story revolves around folk music, its relevance in America in the 60s, and Bob Dylan's outlook on life and love. Timothée Chalamet was tasked with bringing Bob Dylan to life by the great director who made Walk the Line and Ford v Ferrari, two of my favorite biopics. While Bob Dylan gave a nod of approval to Chalamet, it is unknown what the star thinks about the performance. However, critics and fans have seemed to have made up their mind. Now, we've seen many near-perfect biopics and many near-perfect performances in those films, so I ask the question, does Timothée Chalamet's Bob Dylan stand up to the heights of Edgerton's Elton John, Phoenix's Johnny Cash, Cooper's Leonard Bernstein, the motley crew of rockers in the dirt, and more? Stay tuned for a breakdown on all of this and more. Hello and welcome to Studio Cinema Saturday, the show where we review films old and new, the ones you don't like and the ones you do. I'm your host, Kael, and today we're looking at A Complete Unknown, directed by James Mangold, starring Timothée Chalamet. And if you've seen this show before, you know we're going to start out with some of those spoiler-free thoughts at the beginning of the review. And if you haven't seen the show before, welcome, like and subscribe, we'd love to have you back. Go ahead and say what up in the comments, I always respond. So spoiler free, I loved this film. I did a video where I ranked 24 films I'd seen in 2024 because I'd only seen 24 films, and had I seen this film, I think it would have been at the top of the list, genuinely. I loved this movie, and I thought Timothée Chalamet is a great gateway to becoming a Bob Dylan fan if you're not a huge Bob Dylan fan like myself. Now, I wasn't oblivious to who Bob Dylan was, and I definitely did some researching to, kind of familiarize myself and listen to some of the songs I might hear in the movie in the week leading up to seeing the film, but I wouldn't call myself this Bob Dylan super fan. Now, after seeing the movie, I can't stop listening to Bob Dylan. So I'm gonna go ahead and jump right into spoilers in this video, so if you don't want the video spoiled, go ahead and click off, or don't. It's a true story for the most part. I don't know that you can get this spoiled, a story from the 60s. Now, I think it's important to say that biopics are like the film version of the game Telephone. And what I mean by that is there are things that get changed along the way. So let's go ahead and dive into some of the things that got changed here, not for sake of tearing apart the filmmakers, but just for historic sake. And let me say that Mangold has been extremely reliable in the two biopics I mentioned in the intro. And he is on record saying that he's spent about 18 hours talking to Bob Dylan, and that Bob Dylan even had lines that he threw into the movie, and he said it gave him a lot of insight when finishing the script. And it seems like the changes that have made here are reasonable. The way Dylan and Joan Baez met was slightly different, but it was still at a show of his. Baez was apparently in attendance with her boyfriend at the time. Also, we see in the film that the relationship between Bob and Joan becomes sexual when Bob's girlfriend was away during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Many have stated that this timeline doesn't really add up, but the Cuban Missile Crisis did end up inspiring one of his songs, A Hard Rain's Gonna Fall.
And where have you been, my darling, and why?
Truthfully, this makes the viewer hold this action against Dylan less, because it feels like he does this in a state of hopelessness for the world. To continue on, Pete Seeger did host a show called The Rainbow Quest, but Bob Dylan never went on it. This scene is made up for the film, and so is the musician in the scene, Jesse Moffett. But he is played by a real blues musician, Big Bill Morganfield. Sylvia Russo, Bob's girlfriend in the film, is also based off of Bob's real girlfriend, but does have a name change here. Susie Rotello was the artist and activist that Bob was with during the time, and this was a request from Bob Dylan, and I think there are just some personal aspects he probably wanted the film to avoid, rightfully so. There could be other tiny inaccuracies, but based on some of the digging I've done, it seems like this biopic's pretty dang true to Bob Dylan's real life. I feel like these things that have been changed probably did make the story a whole lot easier to tell. Another tiny thing that was changed is that Bob Dylan didn't come up and meet Woody Guthrie when he was in the hospital. They rather met at an apartment, and Pete Seeger was not there. They didn't kind of all gather at the same time, but I think a similar event structure happened. And James Mangold's come on to say some things about these differences, and he said in no ways was he trying to dig up any of Bob's secrets or, you know, give anything that was super telling about Bob's interpersonal life. He was, you know, more approaching this to share, you know, Bob Dylan's views and kind of philosophies with the world, and also kind of show why Bob was so relevant when he was coming up. And I think that's a huge part of the film, is just kind of Bob Dylan's impact at the time, which we'll get into more. And, you know, besides Bob Dylan, I want to say that I really enjoyed the other portrayals of real life people in this film. Joan Baez, played by Monica Barbaro, was absolutely amazing. Pete Seeger takes over the body of Edward Norton so much that you forget it's Edward Norton at times. Scoot McNairy is super impactful as Woody Guthrie, and while Boyd Holbrook is no Joaquin Phoenix, he plays a great version of Johnny Cash who is super impactful to the story, and you can feel that there's some similar direction from Walk the Line. I wonder why. And since this is just about Bob Dylan's life, I'm not gonna hark over and beat over the plot of the story, but I'm more gonna try to explore some of the themes and see what it's trying to say here. Folk music is at the center of this film, and rightfully so given the impact Dylan had on it. But what is more explored here is the impact folk music had on the 1960s. In a time period that has seen endless war, the events of this film see the Cuban Missile Crisis and the death of President Kennedy. The film highlights how the folk artists at the time used their voices and music to spread awareness, speak their opinions, and ultimately speak out against the war and injustice. And you know, we see this wholeheartedly in a track like Masters of War, and this ends up being one of my favorite war songs ever. Shout out War Pigs by Black Sabbath for being number 2. Bob Dylan was known for speaking his mind through his music, and this is just a great example of it. Folk music has a strange yet beautiful blend of independence and evolution and thought, but tradition through music. And when folk music turns on Bob, when his music evolved, he didn't know what to do about it. You see this confliction within Bob, that folk music helped him get to where he is, but it also helped him evolve into who he becomes.
Are you God, Bob?
How many times do I have to say this? Yes.
But he feels like if he only plays what they want him to play, and if he only plays his more folky songs, then he isn't truly fulfilling himself or being true to himself, to the people around him. You see this in other moments where he doesn't really want to play at the party, when he says everyone wants him to play Blowin' in the Wind for the rest of his GD life, and when he decides to play his music at the end of the festival ultimately. Through these moments you see Bob Dylan squeezing to hold on to his artistic integrity, and you see that this ends up becoming something that was very important to Bob Dylan. Like I said at the beginning of this video, Bob Dylan is a man who operates on the thought of independence at all costs. You also see how free-spirited he was, a true rolling stone, if you will. We see he doesn't try to stick with anything or anyone. We see this as he fails to be faithful to Sylvia and his eventual move on from folk music. And you know, let's transition and talk more about, you know, Bob Dylan and love. You know, this is a man who wrote plenty of love songs like Girl from the North Country,
Once was a true love of mine.
Tangled Up in Blue,
Tangled up in blue.
and Make You Feel My Love.
To make you feel my love.
And there are so many more than just this. In this film, we see the sort of love triangle Dylan was in the early 1960s. You know, weird that both films I saw during Christmas week involved a love triangle. This one, of course, features Sylvia Russo and Joan Baez. And you know, we see that Dylan feels like he made a mistake with Sylvia, and he tries to make up for things. He tries to bring her back to the Newport Folk Festival, and you know, this ends up kind of being a disaster. It adds to the disaster. The triangle of love comes to a head when Sylvia has to watch Joan and Bob play It Ain't Me, Babe. And at this point, she just has to leave.
Oh, no, it ain't me, babe. It ain't me you're looking for.
However, However, we see her again one more time as Bob chases her down and they have this super heartfelt goodbye, and it's just a super sad scene. Ultimately, you see that Sylvia doesn't want to get between Bob and Joan, and she can kind of tell that he's been sweet on her when they're singing the song. She's been playing his songs, and she just knows the situation. And you also kind of get this feeling that she can't get in between Bob and the music either. You see all these scenes everywhere he goes. He'll be sleeping with Joan or he'll be sleeping with Sylvia, and he's not even in bed, but he's up writing music all night long. Like, you just kind of see the burning passion within Bob, but you see that he does let it kind of get in the way of his personal relationships. And as an artist, I totally can relate to that. And, to look at his personality a little bit more, I think this just speaks to how he rolled through life. This is the man that said you can make up your own past, and often told people about his days in the carnival that never existed.
People make up their past, Sylvie. They remember what they want. They forget the rest.
Something else that I kind of pull from this film, just personally, is like folk music. I didn't realize how much, folk artists were using their own voices and opinions to spread awareness and things like that. And I thought just the power of folk music was very relevant to this film, but also very present in this film, and I thought it was really cool. Now, I feel like I've explored and extracted about as much as I could and wanted to from this film. I'm super thankful for this film because of how awesome it was. It's such a great, telling and sharing of Bob Dylan's story. I think old Timmy C absolutely killed this shit. I've always seen Joaquin Phoenix's performance as Johnny Cash as the pinnacle of biopics, and I've gotta put Timothée Chalamet up there with him now because of how good his performance was. And you can definitely tell that he spent 5 years seriously learning how to sing, play guitar, and play the harmonica, and he is able to embody Bob Dylan within those things. And while I haven't wanted to stop talking about this film since I saw it, it is time for me to start closing this video off. But if you enjoyed this video, come back for Studio Cinema Saturday next week, where I'm talking about Walk the Line 20 years later, and I'll even be comparing it to this film some. James Mangold film on Studio Cinema Saturday 2 weeks in a row. Starting to think he might be a good director or something. In that video, you may see me make comparisons like the It Ain't Me Babe scene, where this is a scene that lives in both films and during a duet. And I think they even shoot this scene really similarly in this film than they did to Walk the Line. So I think that's really cool. I'm gonna be diving into more things like that next week. Come back every Saturday, catch us here. On Tuesdays, we're doing Television Tuesday, where we're reviewing your favorite TV shows, and we're also here making our own films. So be sure to come back, subscribe to the channel, like this video, comment what you thought down below on A Complete Unknown, and I hope to see you in the next video.